The HOA fined Elon Musk for too many cars. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Instead of backing down, Musk played the long game. He secretly bought up homes in the neighborhood through his companies. The HOA tried to fight back, but it was too late. He didn't just win, he rewrote the game entirely. Stay with us to find out how this unbelievable story ends, and don't forget to subscribe, more thrilling stories are coming just for you. Elon Musk, known worldwide for his relentless innovation and ability to captivate entire industries, once found himself living in an upscale residential development on the outskirts of a city known for its tightly regulated homeowners associations. This community had been meticulously designed, each house almost identical in structure and layout, every lawn measured to precise standards, and all residents bound by a strict set of covenants designed to preserve a certain uniformity. No one in the community had expected an entrepreneur of global renown to purchase one of those homes, and even fewer realized why a man of such means would subject himself to the stifling rules of a homeowners association in the first place. Yet Elon's presence there was an undeniable reality, evidenced by his frequent appearances in the neighborhood in a variety of advanced electric vehicles, sleek prototypes, or occasionally experimental forms of transportation that turned many curious heads. From the beginning, the local HOA had established a somewhat tenuous relationship with him, taking cautious pride in telling outsiders that their community housed a visionary of the modern era. The carefully manicured grass, the symmetrical plantings, and the ever-attentive landscaping crews formed a pleasant backdrop for someone who could afford to live anywhere in the world. Only the usual lines of palm trees, the routine maintenance of the neighborhood central pond, and the clipped hedges offered any distinction from countless other suburban enclaves scattered across the country. Yet behind that postcard-perfect facade, a subtle tension always lurked. People whispered about the possibility of new technologies arriving without notice. They speculated about advanced prototypes being tested on the neighborhood roads. None of these rumors was confirmed, but such talk stirred a growing apprehension within the HOA board, ever keen to defend its meticulously crafted policies. The board president at that time was a meticulous individual known throughout the community for enforcing even the most trivial rules without concession. This figure, an individual named Meredith Ashfield, had overseen the HOA's daily operations for several years with a form of rigid pride that came from an unwavering belief in structure. She prided herself on the serenity and harmony of her domain. Some residents admired her attention to detail, claiming that Meredith's strictness preserved property values, while others found her approach suffocating. In the early days, Meredith seemed delighted to welcome Elon as a property owner, anticipating a notable rise in local prestige. With someone as high-profile as Elon around, the entire community stood to gain a certain luster, perhaps even an influx of potential buyers who might be drawn by the idea of living next to a tech luminary. However, the day arrived when Elon's personal habits began to clash with Meredith's ironclad rules. A faint friction turned into small confrontations, and eventually, it escalated into what many would call an all-out war. It all started with the arrival of multiple vehicles in Elon's driveway. While many families in the neighborhood might own 2 or 3 cars at most, the Musk residents sometimes displayed a revolving selection of nearly a dozen vehicles. Some were standard production models, others sported aerodynamic shapes never before seen on the street. Neighbors gawked but rarely complained at first, considering it a charming quirk of having an inventor in their midst. But the HOA bylaws were explicit: every lot was permitted a certain number of vehicles visible from the street, and anything beyond that number required special permits or storage solutions. Initially, these guidelines had never been forced upon Elon directly because the board presumed his stay was temporary, or that he, of all people, would have no trouble constructing an appropriate garage that complied with every minute rule. But as the months progressed, the cars remained. More models appeared, drawing the watchful eye of those employed by the HOA to document violations. Other complaints began to roll in. Lawn maintenance was occasionally interrupted by re-landscaping experiments on Elon's part. As he tested out newly designed, robotic systems meant to optimize water usage. Light sometimes glowed at odd hours, reminiscent of small-scale flight tests or expansions to the existing solar infrastructure attached to the property. Gossip spread about him flying prototypes around the backyard, though no one had actual evidence. After repeated notifications sent to the Musk household went unaddressed, some possibly lost in the shuffle of corporate mail forwarding, the board grew restless. Meredith in particular believed that no individual should receive preferential treatment. In her mind, if any one person, regardless of fame, remained in open violation of HOA guidelines, there should be consequences. In a private meeting, Meredith and her closest board allies discussed the possibility of levying new fees. Such fees could be instituted under a clause that allowed the board to charge extra for excessive vehicle presence and undue foot traffic. They also reviewed the rule that mandated a thorough assessment whenever a homeowner's parking habits affected the neighborhood aesthetic. Meredith felt emboldened to pursue this approach, convinced that the entire community would support her in upholding the guidelines. As far as she was concerned, Elon's unusual number of cars, plus the frequent deliveries and visits from business colleagues, represented a valid reason to impose additional fees. She believed that if Elon truly valued his place in the community, he would adapt, pay, or leave. The tension was carefully disguised, though word spread among neighbors that a significant confrontation was brewing. A formal letter arrived at Elon's mailbox. It bore the unmistakable logo of the HOA, accompanied by official language describing the new fees and the rationale behind them. If he objected, the letter stated, the homeowner could request a hearing before the board, present any counterarguments, and attempt to negotiate. There was no direct threat of legal action yet, but the tone left no doubt about the HOA's seriousness. Elon had been preoccupied with a range of corporate matters, including expansions of factories and brainstorming sessions for new technology. He rarely had time to examine the small storm forming in his own neighborhood. But once the letter reached his personal assistant, the content was brought to his attention. Neighbors noticed that, over the next several days, the cars in Elon's driveway began to rotate even more frequently, almost as though he were deliberately showcasing new configurations. Some speculated that he might be ignoring the letter entirely. Others thought he might be crafting an innovative solution to circumvent the restrictions. In truth, Elon recognized that the matter could not be dismissed. He made mental notes. The fees were only the first step of what was likely to be a drawn-out conflict if not properly handled. He was no stranger to legal complexities or bureaucratic entanglements, but rarely had he faced such a scenario on a personal level. It was reminiscent of the early challenges he had faced with local zoning laws at other facilities, though on a smaller, more intimate scale. Soon, conversations emerged among the local homeowners about what the board intended to do. Several residents had always harbored resentment toward Elon for the heightened traffic in the neighborhood. Delivery trucks came and went with parts and prototypes, and curious journalists sometimes prowled for glimpses or interviews. There were rumors that the board had considered more aggressive measures, such as restricting deliveries outside certain hours. Others insisted that new color palettes for the houses were being considered so as to remove any individualized flair that might compromise the cohesive look of the area. People whispered that Meredith, determined to maintain her iron grip, had begun collecting photographic evidence of each alleged infraction. She was rumored to have a file that documented every unusual vehicle, every instance of a drone hovering near Elon's property, and every sidewalk blocked by a passing group of media members. Undeterred, Elon watched this development with a mixture of mild amusement and measured caution. The board might have had the power to issue citations and fines, but he possessed extensive resources, including legal teams well-versed in property law. This dynamic set the stage for a clash unlike anything the typically tranquil community had ever seen. Many had believed that the arrival of a figure like Elon Musk might infuse the area with an electric excitement. Little did they know that they were about to bear witness to a quiet revolution in how far the boundaries of an HOA could be stretched. The board soon resolved to hold an emergency meeting, citing the unprecedented nature of the events unfolding. Meredith announced that attendance was mandatory for all board members, and homeowners with concerns about the growing number of vehicles or any additional disruptions were invited. Some residents who had previously avoided the board's gatherings suddenly found themselves eager to attend, driven partly by curiosity and partly by the possibility of seeing Elon engage in a debate. On the evening of the meeting, a hush fell over the usually calm community as people prepared to file into the modest clubhouse near the neighborhood's entrance. The clubhouse itself was not large, but its bland beige walls and fluorescent lighting gave it a sober atmosphere that made every official gathering feel weighty. Residents arrived, taking seats in folding chairs arranged in neat rows. They cast expectant glances between each other, quietly anticipating fireworks. The tension in the air was palpable, fueled by the knowledge that the subject of their attention was no ordinary homeowner, but an individual known for taking bold risks. Many had no doubt that Elon would mount a formidable defense. Contrary to the expectations of those who assumed he might appear only when forced by legal threat, Elon decided to respond swiftly. He was not someone who found comfort in small, insular committees, but he understood the strategic advantage of addressing the issue head-on. Had he chosen to stay silent, the board would have seized further ground, likely imposing more constraints and fees. By making an appearance, he could gauge the board's stance more accurately. He arrived with an aura of calm professionalism that belied the extraordinary nature of his achievements. This was not a high-stakes tech conference or a spaceflight unveiling, but a local meeting about parking regulations. For Elon, however, any conflict regarding freedom to explore innovations, even on a personal scale, was worth careful engagement. Meredith, presiding at the front of the room behind a large wooden table, welcomed everyone formally with an air of precision. The rest of the board members sat around her. A few of them looked uneasy, possibly concerned that the meeting might escalate into an adversarial affair. No one could recall a time when a wealthy entrepreneur had challenged the HOA. Typically, the board's targets were less influential residents who missed a landscaping deadline or placed trash bins out too early. The initial proceedings contained the usual procedural elements, reading through the evening's agenda, addressing a minor dispute about a fence that encroached on a shared walkway, and acknowledging an outdated rule about the color of window shutters. The mundane nature of these early items felt surreal, given the tension saturating the room. When the agenda turned to the matter of parking and additional traffic fees, all eyes shifted to see how Elon would respond. There was an awareness that lines were about to be drawn, and that this night might represent a critical turning point in the neighborhood's history. Meredith delivered an extended explanation of how multiple vehicles and increased foot traffic were detrimental to the community's well-being. She referenced official documents containing occupancy regulations and brought up photos showing cars arranged around Elon's driveway. She insisted that these had been taken over several weeks, documenting a pattern of disregard for established rules. Usually, such evidence would form the backbone of any successful enforcement measure. However, by not openly addressing these accusations in the past, Elon had given them a chance to accumulate what the board considered incriminating proof. It was evident that Meredith believed she had the advantage. She had the rules, the photos, and presumably the majority support of the board. On the surface, it might have seemed that Elon was at a disadvantage, but he had not spent all those weeks ignoring the HOA's letters. Behind the scenes, he had conducted a private but meticulous review of the community's bylaws, studied the original developers' agreements, and even looked into municipal ordinances that empowered or limited the scope of HOAs. He had realized that the board was far from omnipotent. In fact, certain bylaws allowed homeowners to gather enough votes to restructure the board if evidence of mismanagement or bias was found. The trick was to demonstrate that the board members were using rules selectively to advance personal vendettas or ignoring other larger issues that impacted the neighborhood's well-being. At the meeting, some residents who felt burdened by the HOA's relentless scrutiny began to wonder if Elon's involvement might offer them a chance to break free from the association's tight grip. Others believed that the rules must remain unchanged, for fear that property values might decline if the association lost its authority. As the dispute escalated, a swirl of rumors circulated. Some whispered that Elon had discovered a quirk in the legal documents that might allow him to buy out large swaths of homes, or that he had already done so through shell companies. Others joked that he might build rocket launch pads in each backyard if no restrictions were placed on him. The tension did not abate, and before long, the official portion of the meeting ended with no immediate resolution, only the promise of further deliberations. In the ensuing days, letters from the association arrived with increasing frequency. Each pointed to a different clause, each contained a citation or fine, and each had a short deadline for compliance. Residents watched as Elon's driveway continued to hold an evolving collection of vehicles. Instead of hiding away or reducing the visible presence of his fleet, he seemed to be curating it like an exhibition, rotating prototypes in ways that teased the eyes of neighbors. It became a spectacle, drawing curious passers-by and outraging the most ardent supporters of strict conformity. Behind closed doors, the board strategized on how to contain what they now saw as a rebellion against their authority. Meredith's calm composure began to crack as the fines sent to Elon went unanswered or were simply returned with a polite, formal acknowledgement that they had been received and noted. Finally, the board decided that sterner measures were necessary. They scheduled another special session, one they intended to keep behind closed doors, to discuss how far the HOA's legal arm could extend. They considered a lawsuit, possible injunctions, or an outright ban on certain activities. When the news leaked that the board was contemplating legal action, the neighborhood erupted into speculation. Some were thrilled that the board was doubling down, others feared it would spiral into an expensive, protracted confrontation that might harm the entire community. Unbeknownst to Meredith and her inner circle, Elon was not content to let them amass evidence uncontested. A private investigative team, working on his behalf, had been collecting records indicating the board's questionable conduct. They found that Meredith had selectively targeted certain homeowners with strict fines while ignoring egregious violations by her close associates. Some older residents had been penalized for slight deviations in mailbox color, while other properties, belonging to friends of board members, had been spared fines for much larger infractions. This information, carefully compiled, began to form the basis of a potential legal strategy that Elon's attorneys could deploy if the board insisted on escalating matters. In essence, the board was walking into a trap of its own making. Unaware that the individual they saw as a rebellious nuisance was quietly preparing a thorough defense and a potentially devastating counteroffensive. The threat of a lawsuit from either side loomed ominously. Homeowners who had once taken a passing interest in the rivalry realized that they might need to pick a side. If the board lost and was forced to back down, the entire community could experience a shift in how rules were enforced. Some believed that this new approach might usher in a more open atmosphere, one that welcomed individuality and innovation. Others worried that a defeat of the board would leave the neighborhood vulnerable to chaos and a loss of the carefully cultivated aesthetic that many claimed was the reason they had chosen the community in the first place. As the weeks passed, the talk of an official hearing or court case became increasingly unavoidable. Some local media outlets got wind of the story, though the conflict seemed modest compared to Elon's grand industrial ventures. Still, they sensed a human interest angle in the idea that an eccentric billionaire was being challenged by an unremarkable suburban HOA. The board did what it could to control the narrative, claiming they were simply trying to maintain uniform standards for all residents. Elon, on the other hand, made no public statements, preferring to let the tension simmer quietly. Yet behind this veneer of subdued hostility, Elon was preparing carefully, methodically, to leverage every resource at his disposal. He knew that intelligence, strategy, and a precise understanding of the law could accomplish much more than any brash display of wealth. The board, on the other hand, continued to amass more photos of his cars, more accounts of alleged disturbances around his property, and more examples of sidewalks momentarily blocked by deliveries. They believed they were accumulating unassailable proof of Elon's disregard for community standards. Residents who passed by Elon's driveway noticed subtle changes. Landscaping robots roamed, trimming the grass, as though to demonstrate compliance with certain rules while ignoring others. Drones occasionally buzzed overhead, presumably capturing aerial footage. A few neighbors even claimed to see individuals, presumably members of the board or their hired photographers, hiding behind hedges to take photos at odd hours. As if building a dossier to present in a future hearing. The tension between the HOA and Elon's supporters grew more intense. At one point, an elderly couple named the Brandons received a letter informing them of newly increased fees for lawn maintenance, a clear attempt to set an example of the board's strictness. This couple had never even met Elon personally, yet they suspected that the board's recent spike in enforcement was partly an attempt to frame Elon's situation as part of a larger crackdown. Though the Brandons felt powerless, they confided in friends that the board's tactics had become unfair. Elon's attorneys prepared for the possibility of a legal showdown. While the board grew increasingly confident that they had documented enough violations to demand compliance. Some rumored that Meredith might attempt to impose a lien on Elon's property if he refused to pay the mounting fines, an action that would undoubtedly provoke a swift response. Indeed, the stage was set for a dramatic unveiling of strategies. In the background, Elon's personal investigators continued to uncover questionable financial records, suggesting that Meredith had earmarked significant funds for projects that never materialized. These funds had apparently gone to board initiatives with little oversight. At the same time, Elon's legal team found evidence that the HOA bylaws could be exploited if a single owner held a majority stake in the community's combined property rights. It was a structure inherited from the original developer's arrangement, rarely used because few could afford to buy that many properties. It hinted at the possibility that if Elon, or an entity linked to him, owned enough homes or units in the neighborhood, he could effectively sway major decisions without the board's consent. This was, in many ways, the ultimate check against the board's authority. However, it required that enough of the other homeowners be willing to sell. Or that Elon had already orchestrated such purchases quietly. Rumors persisted that a string of properties had recently changed hands at above-market prices to a real estate holding entity with an opaque ownership structure. Residents gossiped that perhaps another investment firm was quietly buying up houses, or that it could be Elon himself. Nevertheless, these were little more than whispers, and few people had ever seen tangible evidence of such a plan. If it was happening, it remained exceedingly well concealed. In the midst of this swirl of intrigue, the entire community braced for the next development. Uncertain whether it would be a legal action from the board or a sweeping countermeasure from the billionaire in their midst. Whichever side triumphed, the outcome would almost certainly reshape the character of the neighborhood. Some dreamt of a more welcoming and innovative place, liberated from the strictest and pettiest of the HOA's restrictions. Others feared the worst, anticipating that a loss of the board's authority would lead to a decline in property values, and that the distinctive uniformity of the development would be lost forever. The older residents watched quietly, recalling times when such disputes had been resolved quickly. This time, the presence of an influential figure with abundant resources meant that an easy resolution was off the table. And so the days dragged on, with both sides gathering evidence and forging alliances. There was no direct confrontation yet, just the dull hum of building pressure, the faint sense that lines were hardening beneath the surface. Every so often, a new fine or notice arrived at the Musk residence, appended with legal language and references to the covenant's numerous sections. Elon's vehicles continued to appear, vanish, and reappear, sometimes leaving behind faint tire tracks that caused further friction with the neighbors. Meanwhile, deliveries continued unabated, fueling the speculation that prototypes were being developed or stored on site. As the tension crescendoed, a date for the official hearing was finally announced. Meredith's board intended to hold a closed-door session to discuss legal steps, accompanied by a public hearing to review the alleged violations and consider possible punishments. A sense of finality swept across the neighborhood, as though the hour of reckoning had arrived. Some residents prepared statements in favor of the board, while others, emboldened by rumored revelations of board misconduct, remained quietly hopeful that Elon would reveal something monumental. In the hush that settled before the hearing, the stage was set for a clash of wills unlike anything the community had known. Those who viewed Elon as a disruptive force hoped he would be made to comply, yet many among the younger, more tech-savvy crowd looked to him with a sense of anticipation, convinced he would break the shackles of an overbearing HOA. The next act would be decisive, and no one knew precisely what form it would take. Whispers drifted through the evening air, echoing off the well-trimmed hedges and pristine lawns, carrying questions of whether a single person's vision, combined with nearly unlimited resources, could reshape the traditional constraints of suburban living. Only the hearing, looming like a storm on the horizon, could reveal the answer. Anticipation hung thick in the days preceding the hearing, with the entire community watching for any hint of sudden developments. Some residents noted that the daily routine around Elon's property continued almost defiantly unaltered, as though the owner had no intention of changing his habits to appease the board. The usual procession of deliveries came and went, leaving behind mysterious parcels, sometimes transported by experimental self-driving cargo vans. Meanwhile, different electric vehicles, some older, some sleek prototypes, still decorated the driveway, rotating in an ever-shifting pattern that confounded any observer trying to document possible infractions. The tension had begun to extend beyond HOA boundaries, with local tabloids publishing speculative reports on whether Elon intended to transform the neighborhood into some kind of futuristic test site. On the morning of the hearing, a slight drizzle blanketed the community's manicured streets, veiling the rows of identical facades in a soft, gray light. It was a rare weather pattern for the region, and many residents took it as a metaphor for the murky undertones of the day's upcoming confrontation. Cars lined the curb near the small clubhouse, which had once again been chosen as the meeting venue. Although the board had originally intended the session to be partially closed, the surge of local curiosity forced them to allow more spectators than usual into the hall. Folding chairs had been arranged in every feasible corner, and neighbors squeezed together in uneasy excitement. A few who had never attended an HOA function in their lives managed to secure spots along the back wall, gazing forward with a mixture of apprehension and fascination. Meredith appeared at the forefront, her demeanor laced with a stoic confidence that suggested she believed the board had an airtight case. She had assembled thick binders that presumably contained the photographic evidence, detailed logs of vehicle sightings, and records of any bylaw infractions her team had meticulously compiled. Some of her closest allies on the board flanked her, each carrying similar documents. The rain, still pattering against the building's roof, provided a subtle, rhythmic backdrop, almost as if nature itself underscored the gravity of the pending showdown. Meanwhile, Elon arrived accompanied by a small contingent of advisors and legal experts. Few in the neighborhood recognized these individuals by sight, but everyone sensed their significance. They moved with quiet assurance, each of them attuned to the tension in the room. The hush that spread at their entrance was palpable. Neighbors averted their eyes or craned their necks, uncertain whether to appear discreet or openly curious. Though Elon's arrival exuded a kind of understated calm, there was an undercurrent of electricity in the air, a sense that something pivotal was poised to unfold. The board opened the hearing by laying out the formal reason for the gathering. They underscored that multiple, ongoing violations had been documented, ranging from alleged overuse of driveway space to disruptions caused by increased traffic and media presence. They referenced specific rules from the thick HOA covenant, each citation matched with a photograph or a note describing the date and time. Those who had seen these pictures whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others dismissing them as minor annoyances unworthy of such a crusade. The occasional stifled cough or shuffled footstep echoed in the clubhouse, where the tension felt nearly suffocating. The board made it clear that they were prepared to escalate the matter to a legal forum if compliance was not forthcoming. All throughout this presentation, Elon remained composed, his expression revealing little. Here and there, his advisors jotted down notes, sometimes exchanging knowing glances. He seemed to be waiting for the board to exhaust its litany of grievances, unconcerned that these accusations might sway public sentiment. Onlookers who favored stricter enforcement hoped that the weight of so much evidence would compel Elon to fold or at least give in to the board's demands. Others, however, suspected he might have an entirely different plan in mind, one he would unveil only when the timing was strategic. Eventually, the board paused, perhaps expecting Elon or his team to launch a defense. The hush in the room became a vacuum, drawing in every flicker of attention. The unwavering sense that something extraordinary was about to happen continued to grow. Some on the board looked uneasy now, as though they could sense the momentum shifting in unseen ways. A few short weeks earlier, the prospect of confronting a wealthy, well-known individual might have seemed daunting, but the board believed their methodical approach had stripped away the guesswork. They had, in their view, a watertight case. Yet with each passing moment, a creeping doubt started to settle into the corners of their minds. As the evidence review concluded, the hearing moved into a phase where the broader community could submit statements. A handful of residents, especially those who disliked the extra media presence, gave brief remarks. They described how reporters occasionally attempted to approach their homes to question them about Elon's habits or the new technologies rumored to be tested behind his house. A couple of residents insisted that the association's rules must apply to everyone equally, even to those with significant resources or fame. However, others spoke up to highlight how the board's constant scrutiny had created an atmosphere of fear, particularly for older homeowners who worried about minor infractions leading to steep fines. The tension escalated as these contrasting opinions wove an intricate portrait of a community in conflict. Torn between admiration for innovation and the desire for orderly uniformity. Once these statements concluded, the possibility arose that Elon might respond or present mitigating evidence. For a moment, it appeared as though he might let his attorneys take over. But then, in a calm and measured manner, Elon indicated that a counterargument had been prepared. His legal counsel, wearing expressions that were impossible to decipher, approached the front. Observers braced themselves for a volley of references to state statutes, HOA's limited powers, or perhaps an argument that the rules had been applied inconsistently. However, what followed was a more far-reaching portrayal of the board's own track record. Without resorting to grand theatrics, Elon's team submitted a series of documents that contested the objectivity and consistency of the board's enforcement history. Detailing multiple instances in which similar or more severe violations by other homeowners had been ignored or minimized if they held close ties with certain members of the board. Furthermore, the material pointed out irregularities in the HOA's budget, including expenditures that never seemed to yield any improvements in the community's infrastructure. The references were backed by canceled checks, suspiciously vague invoices, and deposit records that suggested funds were being allocated toward a nebulous set of consulting and administrative costs. The spotlight turned abruptly toward Meredith, who had presided over those very budgets. She struggled to maintain her composure under the mounting weight of questions that now began swirling around the room. No one dared speak openly in condemnation, but the crowd shifted uncomfortably, aware that these allegations were not trivial, nor easily dismissed. As onlookers absorbed the implications, Elon's legal team continued, pointing out how fines and fees had spiked disproportionately in the last few months, predominantly affecting a handful of residents who lacked the financial or legal resources to resist. The documents went on to hint, in carefully couched language, that any large-scale investments within the neighborhood would inevitably intersect with the board's rules. If a homeowner tried to bring in advanced solar installations, for instance, or install specialized labs for home-based research, the board had the potential to make the process cumbersome. If not impossible, through arbitrary denials and extended reviews. A pattern emerged of seemingly small-scale regulations blocking any attempt at meaningful technological or structural improvements. While many had assumed the board was simply maintaining uniform aesthetics, the newly revealed record suggested something else, a selective gatekeeping driven as much by personal biases as by official guidelines. The entire presentation occurred without dramatic flourishes. But the effect was unmissable. Attendees shifted from viewing Elon's alleged infractions to questioning the structure designed to police them. The balancing act of power in the room began to tilt noticeably. Whether or not Meredith and her allies cared to admit it, the discussion had expanded beyond the issue of driveway parking. It now encompassed the fundamental question of whether the HOA's governing body was acting in good faith or abusing its authority for personal gain. The hearing reached a momentary standstill. The board had planned to follow a standard procedure, presenting violations, hearing a defense, then concluding with a ruling and possibly assessing penalties or announcing further legal steps. But the introduction of evidence pointing toward their own misconduct complicated this plan. If they pressed too hard on Elon's alleged violations, they risked drawing more attention to the possibility that the very rules they claimed to uphold were being selectively enforced. Onlookers who had arrived expecting a confrontation about cars and parking found themselves enmeshed in a broader discussion about the governance of the neighborhood itself. In the subdued confusion that ensued, a sense of stalemate took hold. The board ended the formal session with only vague statements about needing further review. No immediate penalties were enforced that day. Many in the crowd recognized that this was far from over, and that the board would likely regroup behind closed doors, seeking an alternate path to assert its authority. Others concluded that the conflict had already shifted irreversibly, and that no amount of behind-the-scenes maneuvering could fully suppress the information Elon had made public. Observers trickled out into the drizzly afternoon, silent clusters drifting back to their homes, minds churning with the implications of what they had just witnessed. In the days that followed, the murmur of controversy within the neighborhood rose to a fever pitch. Some residents speculated that Meredith was scrambling to unify the board's faction, fearful that dissent from within might weaken their position. Certain rumors suggested that a few board members, who felt uncomfortable with the leadership's methods, were beginning to distance themselves from Meredith. Others openly questioned whether an overhaul of the HOA's leadership structure was imminent. The possibility of lawsuits remained on the table. And notices posted online warned residents that the board was exploring all available legal avenues to protect what they termed the community's best interests. Even as the board struggled to maintain cohesion, Elon's legal team kept working. They refined the data they had presented, building a more comprehensive dossier on the board's practices. Their aim was to ensure that, if forced to litigate, they could demonstrate not only that the charges against Elon were unjustified, but that the entire system of enforcement needed reform. Observers who ventured past Elon's property saw little change in the day-to-day activities. More vehicles arrived and departed, including a truck that some suspected carried prototypes for advanced battery systems. The presence of these experimental technologies fueled yet more gossip, but it was clear that Elon had no intention of altering his routine based on the current stalemate. Meanwhile, a new wave of speculation arose concerning the ownership of multiple properties within the development. A series of real estate transactions was uncovered, in which several nearby homes had been purchased at prices higher than market value. The entity listed on these deeds was a holding company with a nondescript name, offering no clue about its principals. While suspicion naturally fell on Elon, who else might be motivated to buy up so many residences in a neighborhood embroiled in a legal standoff? Some imagined that an outside investor was using the conflict as a smokescreen to seize assets cheaply, anticipating that if the neighborhood's leadership collapsed, property values might fluctuate sharply. Others insisted that Elon was orchestrating a strategic takeover, although no one could prove anything. As time wore on, a handful of smaller-scale events revealed cracks in the board's unity. An older resident, living alone and facing potential fines for an overgrown hedge, received a letter from the HOA that threatened daily penalties. In response, she posted a message on a local online forum, outlining how the board continued to hound her over trivial matters even as they faced serious allegations. She pointed out that her hedge, though indeed untrimmed, did not obstruct any pathway nor pose any safety risk. The message went viral among the residents, prompting a wave of sympathy for her plight and renewed anger toward the board's hardline enforcement. Another resident came forward to recount a puzzling story of having been asked to pay a fast-track approval fee for a minor home improvement project, something not mentioned anywhere in the official fee schedule. Emboldened by these revelations, More and more homeowners began to share stories of questionable practices, from inflated costs for basic services to mysterious line items on monthly statements. Although none of these examples by themselves were overwhelmingly damning, together they formed a pattern that supported the narrative Elon's attorneys had introduced. The realization that this tight-knit organization, which had prided itself on maintaining order and harmony, might be exploiting its authority undermined the confidence of even its most staunch supporters. Facing mounting criticism, Meredith prepared to counter. She doubled down on the argument that Elon's presence threatened the community's carefully balanced equilibrium. She pointed to the ever-growing media attention, the speculative expansions around his property, and the frequent arrivals of staff, claiming these elements endangered the neighborhood's serenity. Yet an undercurrent of desperation tinged her efforts. Some watchers noted that Meredith's public statements had become noticeably more aggressive, calling into question the motives of anyone who dared to align with Elon or question the board's integrity. Despite her attempts, she could not reverse the shifting sentiment that the HOA's leadership had lost a crucial measure of credibility. Finally, the board announced that it would convene an emergency assembly for all residents, stating that they intended to address the pressing concerns about the association's practices. This meeting differed from the usual small-scale, board-focused gatherings. Instead, it invited every homeowner to vote on key provisions, particularly those involving budget oversight, rules enforcement, and transparency. The upcoming assembly promised to be a watershed moment, an opportunity for the board to demonstrate either its willingness to embrace reform or its determination to tighten its grip on the community. In the lead-up to the assembly, rumors circulated that Elon's legal team was finalizing a separate legal motion aimed at challenging the board's authority in court. But more dramatic was the whispered possibility that Elon had covertly achieved a level of property ownership that could grant him or his affiliated entities significant influence in any community-wide vote. Had he truly acquired that many homes within the neighborhood? Those who had kept close tabs on recent real estate filings guessed that at least a dozen properties had changed hands, though whether that number approached a critical mass remained unclear. A wave of apprehension swept through the development at the thought that a single resident, however illustrious, might effectively steer the entire HOA if he secured enough votes or proxies. On the evening of the emergency assembly, residents once again gathered in the clubhouse, which now seemed perpetually crowded and tense. Many arrived early to secure seats, for they suspected that this gathering would either resolve some of the uncertainty or plunge the community into a deeper factional divide. Meredith stood by her table at the front of the room, alongside a handful of board loyalists. They looked noticeably stressed, the lines under their eyes betraying a sleepless night. Large piles of documents sat stacked on the board's table, presumably referencing finances, proposed amendments, and official guidelines. As the meeting started, Meredith attempted to assert control over the narrative by reiterating the board's devotion to maintaining uniform standards, claiming that any calls for transparency had already been addressed in prior documentation. Her voice, though steady, carried an undercurrent of defensive exasperation. She also alluded to the possibility that outside influences, meaning, by implication, Elon, were undermining the community's stability for personal gain. The atmosphere in the room, thick with skepticism, offered little sympathy for her standpoint. Having witnessed the pattern of questionable enforcement and budget irregularities, many residents were no longer inclined to accept explanations at face value. The board then presented a series of proposed rule changes aimed at curbing excessive presence of disruptive elements. These amendments ranged from restricting the number of large deliveries a homeowner could receive within a certain time window to imposing additional surcharges for any property improvements that required outside consultations. The proposals were broad, vague, and seemed to grant the board even greater latitude to regulate the daily lives of residents. Observers exchanged worried looks, unsure whether such rules could feasibly be implemented without intense backlash. Yet the board pressed on, insisting these measures were necessary for preserving the neighborhood's character. Shortly thereafter, the floor opened for resident commentary. A wave of voices rose in immediate opposition, citing how these proposals could be abused to target any homeowner deemed problematic or uncooperative. Several individuals who had never spoken out before seized the opportunity to express long-standing grievances. They demanded clarity on how funds were being used, particularly the ones marked for administrative overhead, which had ballooned in recent years. Some questioned the ethics of financially penalizing those who sought modest alterations to their homes, especially when the community was already laden with costly HOA dues. It was soon evident that the board was unprepared for this level of challenge from its own residents. The usual intangible power that came from presiding over a subdued population was starting to unravel. Speculations drifted through the crowd that a key moment was approaching. A motion to restructure or dissolve parts of the board might be put on the table, depending on how the voting proceeded. Eyes darted nervously toward Elon, who stood among his advisors and attorneys, quietly observing the proceedings. He had not yet made any overt move, leaving onlookers to wonder if he planned to introduce a game-changing announcement. The board, sensing the precarious situation, attempted to rally support by reminding everyone of the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony and the historically stable property values that many credited to strict rule enforcement. They distributed charts showing how the community's average home prices had risen over the past decade, implying that the HOA's firm guidelines were responsible. But the charts failed to address the immediate accusations of selective enforcement and murky budgets. A measure of frustration, once constrained, began to surface among homeowners who felt they had been poorly represented or even exploited. In the midst of this rising clamor, Elon's legal counsel quietly circulated additional documents among certain homeowners, offering clarity on exactly where their HOA fees had been allocated. These included line items for never-completed landscaping projects, suspiciously vague reimbursements for board travel, and unexplained expenses related to meetings that bore no agenda. The revelations spread like wildfire. Many realized that money collected under the promise of improving the community might have been misappropriated, or at least spent in ways that provided minimal benefit to the residents. Whispers turned to a hum of discontent, then to pockets of outright anger. The room was rapidly approaching an uproar. Just as it seemed that any semblance of order might collapse entirely, one of the board members, a woman named Clarissa who had so far remained conspicuously silent, signaled she had something important to share. Her face pale with what appeared to be guilt or dread. She began referencing internal communications that explained how Meredith and a small inner circle had controlled many aspects of the HOA's decision-making, keeping even other board members in the dark. Though the crowd hungered for more details, Meredith acted quickly, insisting that any such disclosures would be out of order. Clarissa hesitated, likely torn between loyalty to the board and the moral imperative to speak truthfully. The tension escalated to a point where it threatened to consume the entire meeting. Residents began shouting demands for a transparent audit, while Meredith attempted to restore calm by hammering through procedural points. The chaos reached a fever pitch, leaving many uncertain if the night would end in resolution or if it would simply fuel further polarization. Standing at the back of the room, Elon observed the drama with an inscrutable composure. He appeared neither surprised nor distressed by the crescendo of conflict, as though he had long anticipated that matters would unfold this way. Some onlookers guessed that he was simply waiting for the ideal moment to act, while others speculated he might opt for a measured retreat and let the board self-destruct under the weight of its own mismanagement. Yet those who had followed his career knew that passivity was rarely in his repertoire. He would likely show his hand soon, revealing how he intended to navigate the final stages of this struggle. As the meeting stretched into the late hours, fresh storms of dissent continued to erupt, overshadowing any neat outcome. By the time the last arguments fizzled out, no clear consensus had been reached on the new rule proposals. Instead, the community seemed poised on the brink of a far larger transformation. Homeowners departed in scattered groups under the flickering streetlights, voices hushed by exhaustion and apprehension. Some paused at the walkway leading to Elon's property, studying it as if searching for clues about what might come next. They saw the dim glow of lights in the windows, the silhouettes of vehicles in the driveway, and a sense of quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from behind the gates. In the wake of this tumult, the board had little choice but to regroup yet again. The constant barrage of accusations, combined with an increasingly skeptical population, compelled them to either refute the claims or face the likelihood of a mass revolt. Even among the board members themselves, private communications grew frantic. More members began reaching out to Clarissa, urging her to share whatever she knew. Some sought to salvage their reputations, others simply feared they might be caught in the crossfire of a legal disaster. Meanwhile, Meredith's frustration mounted. She was unaccustomed to having her authority questioned so openly and found herself struggling to preserve the illusion of unity. The next few days brought unexpected twists. A leaked internal memo surfaced, outlining plans for a special assessment that would have imposed steep costs on all homeowners under the guise of infrastructure improvements. The memo revealed that the actual funds were earmarked for covering legal fees the board anticipated would arise from a pending confrontation with Elon. Outrage thundered through the community once the memo began circulating, intensifying calls for leadership change. Residents who had once passively accepted extra fees in the name of maintaining the neighborhood's manicured aesthetic now drew a sharp line. They refused to be burdened with special assessments just to finance a board's legal campaign against a single homeowner, regardless of the tensions involved. Without any official updates from Elon himself, rumors flourished. Some insisted that he was on the verge of filing a countersuit against the board, while others believed he was aligning with disaffected board members to orchestrate an internal coup. A few hypothesized that he intended to hold a referendum on dissolving the HOA altogether, a move that would require a significant percentage of resident votes. The more optimistic residents envisioned a future where the neighborhood became a pilot site for advanced sustainable technologies, free from stifling red tape. Others clung to the notion that strict regulation was essential, worried that the entire place would turn into a chaotic free-for-all if the board lost its power. Yet Elon was not oblivious to the complexities of dissolving an HOA or dramatically transforming it. He and his legal advisors recognized that such a path would necessitate meticulous planning, cooperation from a majority of homeowners, and a robust legal basis. They also knew that the board, though compromised, would not vanish without resistance. A cornered entity often fought with heightened desperation, particularly when those in charge risked losing not just authority, but also financial benefits and social standing. Through all of this, neighbors exchanged stories of seeing more unusual deliveries to Elon's property. One saw a large, unmarked trailer in the early hours of the morning, quietly unloading crates that were swiftly moved inside. Another claimed they spotted technicians wearing lab coats near the side garage, possibly calibrating a piece of equipment that hummed softly in the darkness. These tales, half rumor and half eyewitness account, underscored that Elon was simultaneously involved in a personal war with the HOA and continuing his relentless push for innovation, merging them into a single narrative that kept the community on edge. Then, a new item began appearing in mailboxes, a formal notice announcing a forthcoming vote to replace certain board members. Evidently, enough signatures had been collected under the bylaws to trigger a special election. The date was set for only a few weeks away, leaving precious little time for the entrenched leadership to respond. Many residents greeted the notice with cautious optimism, viewing it as a chance to rebuild trust in the association. Others worried that if the board was voted out in haste, the resulting power vacuum could cause chaos. What was undeniable was that the community had never before witnessed such a swift mobilization of resident power. An undercurrent of excitement pervaded the neighborhood's daily rhythms. Everywhere people went, to the small local grocery, to the park, to the shared recreational areas, conversations buzzed about the upcoming vote. Friendships were tested, as some individuals passionately defended the board's original role in maintaining property standards, while others championed a new era of openness and innovation. In the center of this brewing storm sat Elon, still revealing no public statement but clearly maneuvering in ways that shaped the unfolding drama. Speculation about a quiet takeover of properties grew more heated. Some claim to have recognized names linked to Elon's other ventures on newly filed deeds. Others thought the real estate purchases might be an unrelated phenomenon, though few genuinely believed in such coincidences. As the special election date neared, it became evident that the outcome would hinge upon both the trust the community still had in the existing board and the lure of fresh leadership that promised to end the invasive fines and backroom deals. Behind the scenes, Meredith coordinated a last-ditch effort to consolidate her supporters. Internal emails urged those loyal to her to rally homeowners who had historically benefited from the board's leniency. She gambled on a coalition that included older residents wary of drastic change, along with families who feared a free-form environment that might tarnish property values. Simultaneously, her critics ramped up their campaign, sharing details of the questionable spending and heavy-handed enforcement. Before long, yard signs began to sprout throughout the neighborhood, some affirming support for the incumbent board, others calling for a total reset. At last, the day of the special election dawned, carrying with it a heavy sense of finality. The clubhouse once again served as the central hub, with volunteer monitors and representatives from each faction set up behind folding tables. Lines formed early, with neighbors greeting one another in subdued tones, aware that the choices they made now would reverberate through every aspect of the community's life. Tension crackled in the air. Some residents cast their votes quickly, eager to be done with the ordeal. Others lingered, discussing the complexities or scrutinizing last-minute flyers distributed by the board or its opponents. After the polls closed, people gathered in small clusters outside, waiting for the results. The usual calm of the well-lit street seemed to pulse with collective heartbeat as the volunteers inside tallied votes. Over the hours, the atmosphere grew restless. Parents tried to distract their children, while older neighbors sat on portable chairs, anxious to hear whether the board would retain or lose its power. Discussions frequently circled back to Elon, who was not visibly present, but whose influence permeated every corner of the controversy. Finally, near midnight, the official talliers emerged. A hush fell over the crowd. The numbers, announced in measured tones, indicated a decisive turnover. Several key board members, including Meredith, had been voted out by a significant margin. A set of newcomers aligned with transparency and reform had been elected. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of reactions, some jubilant, others stunned into silence. People shook hands, embraced, or gazed warily at neighbors who had chosen the opposite side. Though the outcome was clear, the path forward was not. The months of turmoil had left scars, and the new leadership faced the Herculean task of restoring unity, trust, and a sense of direction for the community. Meredith, visibly shaken and nearly speechless, stepped away from the swirl of people, flanked by a few staunch loyalists. Within minutes, she had vacated the clubhouse, leaving behind an atmosphere of raw triumph mixed with lingering tension. The old guard was unseated, but no one could quite predict the consequences of such a dramatic upheaval. Some neighbors whispered that the association's finances would need a full audit, while others worried about the legal battles left in the wake of the board's abrupt fall. Would the new leadership manage to settle the dispute with Elon amicably, or would they face fresh challenges as the details of ownership stakes, lawsuits, and technological ventures became clearer? As the crowd dispersed in the early hours, conversation turned inevitably to Elon's role in the election. Most assumed his silent influence had paved the way for the upset, but the exact mechanism remained a subject of speculation. Some believed that a block of newly purchased properties had voted in unison, handing the deciding margin to the reform-minded candidates. Others surmised that grassroots dissatisfaction among ordinary residents had simply reached a tipping point. Likely it was a mixture of both. In any case, the moment heralded a new chapter for the community, one laced with both immense possibility and profound uncertainty. The next day dawned with the same neat lawns and identical facades that had always defined the neighborhood. On the surface, everything appeared unremarkable, yet beneath that veneer, everything had changed. Cars passed each other with wary nods, homeowners lingered by their mailboxes, softly discussing how the turnover might affect their daily lives. Although the rancor of the election still weighed heavily, a collective curiosity began to blossom. Perhaps the new HOA leadership, with fewer personal agendas and a willingness to accommodate responsible progress, could usher in a new era of collaboration. Maybe the days of stifling oversight had ended, or perhaps an even more thorough reckoning lay ahead. No one could say for sure. But as the clouds parted and sunlight fell across Elon's driveway, illuminating the sleek angles of a row of electric vehicles, a sense of quiet optimism crept into the atmosphere. Though the legal and structural challenges were far from resolved, the central dynamic had shifted significantly. For now, the old fear of retribution from an all-powerful board was gone, replaced by a vigilant hope that innovation and community spirit might blend more harmoniously. The path forward remained unwritten, poised between the mistakes of the past and the boundless potential of the future. In the days that followed the special election, a hesitant sense of renewal settled over the neighborhood. Dawn after dawn, the familiar patterns of life continued. Lawns were trimmed, packages arrived, and children rode their bicycles along winding sidewalks. Yet, behind that near-ordinary facade, the community buzzed with uncertainty. The newly installed Homeowners Association board took their seats for the first official meeting, determined to untangle the layers of confusion and tension that had consumed the neighborhood for months. While the board members hoped to avert more conflict, the sheer depth of the structural issues they had inherited became evident as soon as they examined the association's records. Documents once withheld from public view were slowly being opened. The new board discovered anomalies that supported many of the suspicions long voiced by homeowners. Budgets had been padded with vague references to administrative overhead, inconspicuous fees had been levied under the guise of improving amenities never constructed. And certain homeowners who retained close ties to the ousted leadership had been spared fines for egregious violations. Many association policies, though superficially framed to preserve property values, had more often served as mechanisms for controlling residents' decisions and funneling money towards select initiatives. The novices who now stepped into leadership roles faced an imposing burden. They needed to prove themselves worthy of trust, rebuild fractured relationships, and make swift progress toward greater transparency. Elon, for his part, remained outwardly calm. His home still played host to a rotating lineup of electric vehicles and experimental deliveries, a fact that seemed less provocative now that the most draconian enforcers were gone from the HOA. Residents who once grumbled about the surge of traffic appeared more tolerant in light of the shifting climate. Perhaps they realized that the previous board's heavy-handed measures had done little but breed resentment, or perhaps they sensed that the new leadership might forge a more flexible approach. Still, the undercurrents of tension had not disappeared entirely. The fallout of the power shift made it unclear who would bear responsibility for the association's numerous unresolved controversies. One of the first urgent tasks for the reconstituted board was to conduct a formal audit of the HOA's finances. With the help of professional accountants, they combed through ledger after ledger, unearthing record-keeping that often seemed disorganized by design. The deeper they looked, the more irregularities emerged: overly generous reimbursements for meals supposedly purchased during official HOA events, consulting fees billed to individuals with nebulous roles, and unexplained check withdrawals that never aligned with any tangible improvements. News of these discoveries circulated rapidly among homeowners. Some individuals felt outraged at the blatant misuse of their dues. Others expressed relief, hoping that an official audit might accelerate the process of cleaning house and setting the neighborhood on a better course. Yet, for all the board's newfound accountability, the question of Elon's potential legal showdown with the association still loomed. Letters from attorneys, both Elon's and ones who had represented the old board, spoke to an intricate dispute that had not disappeared overnight. If anything, the scale of the conflict appeared to be expanding. As the new board delved further into the murky finances and suspect rulemaking, they uncovered more instances where the previous leaders might have breached their fiduciary duty. Each such revelation cast doubt on the association's ability to uphold fines and fees that had been levied under dubious pretenses. Many residents now believed that the citations targeting Elon might lack legitimacy. In hushed conversations by mailboxes or while walking dogs in the early evening, people speculated that Elon would soon file a sweeping motion to invalidate the backlog of penalties and charges that had once threatened to spiral into a legal maelstrom. Behind closed doors, the new board considered approaching Elon directly. They hoped to find a face-saving resolution that would repair the fractious relationship between the homeowner and the institution meant to govern the community. Some board members envisioned that if Elon recognized their genuine intent to introduce reforms, he might agree to drop any pending litigation or demands for damage claims. Others feared that, given his resources and determination, Elon might see this as an opportune moment to press for even more drastic changes, potentially undercutting the HOA's authority in ways that would leave it vulnerable and ineffectual. As the leaders weighed their options, the scandal tied to the old board spread outside the confines of the neighborhood. A local news channel learned about allegations of misappropriated funds and the role that the previous president, Meredith, and her allies had played. Reporters showed up at the clubhouse, hoping for interviews that would expose the scope of the alleged corruption. Though the newly elected board members often declined to speak on camera, the news crews managed to piece together enough information from the public records to generate sensational headlines. Clips of well-trimmed lawns and matching home facades filled the television screen as anchors explained to viewers that even a pristine suburban haven could be racked by scandal when power and money intersected behind the scenes. Meredith, in the meantime, had retreated from public view. According to neighbors, she had relocated temporarily to a property she owned outside the city, possibly to avoid the scrutiny that built steadily in her old stomping grounds. Former board loyalists bickered among themselves, attempting to shift blame or deny complicity, while a few avowed that they had merely followed instructions. None of them was eager to be cast as the scapegoat for the financial and ethical mess that had come to light. Days turned into weeks, and the neighborhood's new leaders pressed forward with their audit, discovering new details that both astonished and dismayed them. Residents filed into HOA-sponsored town halls, seeking updates on the findings and answers about what the future held. At one such gathering, the atmosphere was tense yet strangely hopeful, as many believed the community was finally shaking off the yoke of the old regime. The new board tried to project stability. They acknowledged that the association had made mistakes, offered to reimburse certain unfairly charged fees, and pledged to create an oversight committee with rotating membership to safeguard against any single group's dominance. However, the question of Elon's legal stance refused to fade away. Residents wondered if the conflict that had initially been about multiple cars in a driveway had evolved into a deeper matter of principle, one that might not be resolved by superficial reforms. Some watchers believed Elon was waiting to see if the new board would take decisive steps toward a fair, innovation-friendly environment. Others speculated that he was preparing for a final legal confrontation that would put all the association's past misdeeds on record. Whispers of multi-million-dollar lawsuits and possible injunctions floated through the community like an ever-present specter. Eventually, the day arrived when a thick packet of legal papers was delivered to the HOA's mailbox. The association's manager retrieved the documents with trembling hands. While the formal language looked dense and intricate, it was unmistakably a set of legal filings from Elon's legal team, addressed to the entire association. Fear spread among the board members that the reformed body might be engulfed in a courtroom battle that could bankrupt the HOA. At the same time, some of them recognized that these filings might contain the blueprint for resolving matters once and for all. It was time to confront the question of whether the old board's indiscretions had invalidated the claims against Elon and, if so, how the association could salvage its legal and financial integrity. The new board conferred at length with their own attorneys, dissecting each page of Elon's filings. To their relief, these documents did not seek to obliterate the HOA. Rather, they laid out a carefully constructed argument. Since the board under Meredith had acted beyond the scope of its authority, selectively enforcing rules and potentially misusing funds. Any fees assessed against Elon were tainted by bias and thus legally unenforceable. Furthermore, the filings requested restitution for costs Elon had incurred in fighting those penalties, alongside a provision requiring the HOA to revise its governing documents so that no future board could replicate the same kinds of abuse. It was, in many ways, a comprehensive call for transformation. Instead of simply demanding money, Elon sought structural changes that would recast the HOA as a truly transparent and limited governing entity. The new board, eager to avoid a draining court battle, huddled over the fine print. They realized that most of Elon's demands aligned with the reforms they had already started to discuss: more equitable rule enforcement, a higher threshold for passing new fees, and external audits performed regularly. Some members, however, resisted what they saw as ceding too much power to a single resident. They worried about setting a precedent that one wealthy homeowner could dictate policy changes. On the other hand, they recognized that if they chose to fight a protracted lawsuit, the HOA might be forced to spend vast sums on legal fees it could not afford. Especially given the budgetary wreckage left behind by the old board. A tense stretch of time followed. As lawyers from both sides engaged in negotiations that felt more like a high-stakes game of chess than a suburban dispute. At each step, Elon's attorneys pointed to fresh examples of the old board's misconduct to justify why robust oversight was needed going forward. Meanwhile, the HOA's legal team, representing the newly reformed board, tried to ensure that any settlement retained enough autonomy for the association to continue functioning effectively. Through numerous drafts and conference calls, the outlines of an agreement slowly emerged. The deal would absolve Elon of the fines that had sparked the initial conflict, provide partial compensation for his legal expenses, and, crucially, mandate that the HOA's bylaws be revised to include transparent governance measures. While negotiations inched toward conclusion, life in the neighborhood displayed a refreshing new openness. The new board suspended all pending citations so they could re-evaluate them under a fair process. Neighbors who had once been at odds over petty squabbles or retracted fines began to hold small gatherings to voice ideas about how the association could better serve its residents. The swirl of negativity that had surrounded the old administration began to dissipate, replaced by cautious optimism that the community might finally move forward, free from overreaching policies and shadowy corruption. During this interval, curious stories began to surface about Elon's broader vision for the area. Rumors abounded that he was pioneering a small-scale urban experiment here, testing how advanced solar, battery, and transportation technologies could integrate seamlessly into a typical suburban setting. Some said the neighborhood might eventually install a pilot microgrid, powered by rooftops and communal energy storage, turning the community into a shining example of sustainable living. While the details remained unconfirmed, many homeowners found themselves surprisingly receptive to such ambitions. For the first time in the neighborhood's short history, the concept of uniform lawns and tight restrictions gave way to a sense of possibility about new ideas that might benefit everyone. Finally, after lengthy negotiation and painstaking review, both sides reached a settlement. An official announcement made its way into every homeowner's mailbox. It outlined a plan in which the association would rescind all previously contested fines, reimburse Elon for specific legal costs, and receive clear guidelines on how to enact new rules, ensuring each step was backed by majority approval and subject to external audits. The HOA's leadership would also be bound to an annual review by a third-party auditor, preventing any future board from operating without oversight. In return, Elon agreed not to pursue further legal claims related to the old board's misdeeds, on the condition that the new system would remain in place. The settlement struck a balance between the autonomy of the neighborhood and the fundamental checks and balances that Elon believed necessary to safeguard against abuse of power. Reactions among residents varied from relief to suspicion. Some worried the settlement signaled that the HOA had capitulated too eagerly to Elon's demands. Others noted, with a touch of satisfaction, that the reforms spelled out in the agreement were exactly the kind of protections the community needed to avoid repeating the old board's mistakes. The new leadership, though wary of the perception that they had bowed to a single powerful individual, understood that the settlement gave them a firm foundation to rebuild trust. They framed it not as Elon's victory alone but as a systematic clearing of the rot that had infested the HOA's structure. If there was any lingering doubt about the outcome, it dissipated on the day the new bylaws were officially ratified. The board held a special open-door session in the clubhouse, attracting more residents than any prior meeting in recent memory. People lined the walls and spilled onto the back patio, many poring over the newly printed texts that promised regular audits and transparent decision-making. When the final signatures were applied, a quiet cheer and a gentle applause spread through the room. Even the previously skeptical faces showed tentative approval of these changes, recognizing that they had just witnessed a milestone in the neighborhood's history. That same evening, after the formalities concluded, neighbors wandered the streets, sharing their reflections under the glow of streetlights. The hush of the suburb, once permeated by silent fear of board reprisals, now carried a different energy, one of relief and renewed community spirit. Homeowners who had bitterly contested each other's fence lines or mailbox heights found themselves talking about new gardening projects, potential collaborative upgrades, and ways to maintain the revitalized sense of unity. The transformation was subtle, but it was real. In the days that followed, various stakeholders worked to bring the settlement's promises to life. Local contractors were hired to install an updated security system at the clubhouse, ensuring that any confidential records could not be tampered with again. Volunteers formed committees tasked with evaluating everything from street maintenance to potential green energy initiatives. The new oversight procedures meant these committees had to communicate openly, publish meeting minutes, and encourage resident feedback, an approach that had been unthinkable under the secretive norms of the past. Meanwhile, Elon's estate carried on in its trademark, boundary-pushing fashion. Newly developed solar tile arrays appeared on rooftops, not only on his own home but on several adjacent houses whose owners opted into pilot programs. Rumors spread that a set of next-generation battery modules was quietly supplying power to a cluster of homes, part of an experimental project designed to see how seamlessly the entire neighborhood might transition to clean energy. Delivery vehicles that roamed the local streets looked different from the standard trucks of major courier companies, and folks recognized them as prototypes of autonomous driving systems. Despite the futuristic undercurrent, the tension that once accompanied every new sighting of Elon's technology seemed largely gone, replaced by a rising curiosity. People often gathered in driveways or out on their lawns, smiling as a fresh wave of high-tech gadgetry rolled by. No longer seeing it as a threat but as an intriguing glimpse of possibility. In many ways, it appeared that the new era for the neighborhood was just beginning. Interwoven with the settlement stipulations and the idealistic undertones of Elon's broader ambitions. If any doubt lingered about the ultimate victor in the long legal standoff, the final steps made it clear that Elon had achieved something far beyond the dismissal of nuisance fines. He had effectively forced the HOA to reform in a manner that safeguarded all homeowners from abuses of power. The carefully brokered agreement, which demanded objective processes and external accountability, served as a model that neighboring communities began to notice. People from adjacent areas even reached out, asking how they might replicate similar oversight in their own HOAs. Hoping to avoid the perils of unchecked authority, word traveled through local media outlets that the neighborhood, once the site of a contentious battle between a billionaire and a rigid homeowners association, had emerged stronger and more dynamic. An investigative reporter revisited the community for a follow-up piece, describing how the uniform rows of houses now hosted a fascinating blend of old and new ideas. Alongside the mandated aesthetic consistency, lawns still had to be cut, mailboxes still matched in height, there were solar roofs, advanced irrigation systems that used reclaimed water, and pilot composting initiatives that integrated seamlessly into the overall plan. Though still an HOA, it had become a place where progressive ventures found legitimate space to thrive. As the year rolled on, the changes took root. The once toxic atmosphere gave way to broader civic engagement. Residents turned out in greater numbers for board meetings, committees teamed with new members, and the sense of ownership that had been elusive for years finally took hold. While occasional disagreements still occurred, there were conflicts over landscaping preferences, neighborhood security measures, and the usual friction that came with communal living. No one feared retaliation by a select circle of insiders. The processes were open and the finances transparent, ensuring that each issue received thoughtful debate. For Elon himself, life continued much as it had, albeit with fewer standoffs. The cars in his driveway still rotated with each passing week, showcasing an array of models in development or just out of production. Neighbors had grown accustomed to the unusual hum of machinery that might accompany testing sessions for specialized equipment. Many welcomed it, having come to see it as part of the neighborhood's identity. Some even speculated that the presence of these futuristic vehicles and technologies had helped raise local property values. An ironic twist given the old board's fear that Elon's unusual lifestyle would undermine the entire community's aesthetic. Occasionally, glimmers of the past reminded everyone how far the neighborhood had traveled. A stray letter or email from someone loyal to Meredith would surface, urging caution against giving too much power to any single resident, billionaire or otherwise. Yet these concerns rarely found solid footing, primarily because the new bylaws distributed authority widely, leaving no opportunity for a few individuals to monopolize control. In a final nod to collective healing, the association agreed to rename one of its community parks after a longtime resident who had been forced out by the old board's relentless fines. The gesture served as a sign of good faith, an attempt to acknowledge past wrongs and honor those who had suffered most under the previous regime. In quiet moments around sunset, when the everyday bustle settled and the manicured lawns glowed under the soft light, the transformation was most apparent. Gone was the sense of dread that once accompanied the sight of an HOA official strolling around with a clipboard. Instead, neighbors greeted one another warmly, discussing upcoming projects or sharing fresh produce grown in small garden plots that had once been banned for fear of spoiling the uniform look. Children raced along the sidewalk, unconcerned about arbitrary restrictions on bike storage or chalk drawings. In many ways, the place had grown into a vibrant community, united by the shared understanding that rules, when fairly applied and transparently enforced, could protect rather than oppress. And thus, the long legal saga concluded on a note of renewal. No triumphant parade marked its end, and no headlines declared a decisive victor. Instead, the victory manifested in the subtle glow of confidence that now characterized the neighborhood, confidence that homeowners, whatever their differences, were finally free to shape their environment in a way that combined collective well-being with individual initiative. In that sense, Elon had accomplished far more than overturning a handful of unfair fines. He had helped expose a system's vulnerability to corruption, prompted an entire community to re-examine its foundations, and spurred everyone to build something better in its place. People often cited the settlement with the HOA as yet another example of his relentless vision, proving that intellect, tenacity, and a refusal to be stifled by arbitrary rules could indeed reshape even the most rigid structures. In the end, the quiet suburban enclave that once bristled with tension became a place of cautious wonder. Rows of uniform houses still stood in neat lines, but the spirit within them had been transformed by transparency, fairness, and a willingness to embrace innovation. A single spark, catalyzed by one individual's determination to break through seemingly mundane constraints, had ignited a series of reforms. And as homeowners walked past Elon's driveway with a nod of greeting, they saw not just an array of automobiles but a glimpse of what could happen when an unwavering intellect took on a system and won.